The winter wind swept through South Side Chicago with a kind of quiet cruelty, rattling the thin window panes of Beatrice Simon's small apartment. The radiators hissed in protest, their warmth struggling to reach the far corners of the single-bedroom space. A faint scent of garlic and rosemary drifted from the stove, curling into the air like an unspoken promise. Beatrice stood by the dining table, her faded cream sweater sleeves rolled to her elbows. The fabric clung lightly to her, softening the roundness of her belly. 5 months along now, though the way she rested her hand there made it clear she felt the life within her far more than anyone could see. She had been told her eyes were her most striking feature, deep brown and steady, but tonight there was a flicker in them, half nervous anticipation, half quiet hope. The tablecloth was a hand-me-down from her late mother, its edges worn but carefully ironed. The pattern of blue peonies faded from years of use. 2 plates sat perfectly aligned silverware gleaming, despite having been polished with nothing more than dish soap and determination. A simple roast chicken, golden and fragrant, rested at the center. She had chosen the meal with intention. It was William's favorite. For a moment she paused, gazing out the small kitchen window. The view was hardly glamorous, just a narrow alley, lit by the amber glow of a flickering street lamp. But she remembered the first night William had walked her home. Back then, he'd told her she deserved the view from the top of the world, not from a brick-walled alley in Chicago. And she had believed him. Beatrice had met William Brown 2 years earlier at a charity gala hosted by the University of Chicago's alum board. She had been a scholarship student in the biochemistry master's program, working part-time in the lab, when she'd been convinced by a pushy classmate to attend. William had been different that night, warm, attentive, and shy, making her curious. His laugh had been low and unguarded, his blue eyes quick to find hers in the crowd. She'd thought, here is a man who could see me, not just the version of me that fits in a lab coat. She carried that memory with her now, like a talisman against the uncertainty gnawing at her ribs. The sound of the door unlocking drew her out of her reverie. She smoothed her sweater, took a slow breath, and turned just as William stepped inside. His camel coat hung open, the sharp lines of his tailored navy suit rumpled from the day. The silk of his tie, deep burgundy, was loosened, his posture carrying the weariness of someone who had been in constant motion since sunrise. "How was your day?" she asked softly, moving to take his briefcase. He glanced at her, his gaze flickering briefly to her stomach before shifting away. "Long," he said, crossing the room to pour himself a whiskey from the bottle on the shelf. "My managing partner kept me late running projections for the quarterly portfolio, but it was worth it. I've got news." Beatrice's smile was warm and genuine. "I have news too, but you go first." William sank into the chair at the head of the table, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "I got promoted to senior associate analyst, not just a title B. This means my trajectory changes. I've been invited to the Union League Club this weekend, to a private table with Robert Langley." His voice carried a rare note of excitement, his eyes alight. "That's incredible." "William," she said, reaching across the table to take his hand. Her news fluttered in her chest, eager to be spoken. "I knew you'd make it." She paused, her gaze steady. "And my news, it's about us. The doctor confirmed last week." She drew in a breath. "We're having twins." The words seemed to hang in the air for a fraction too long. William's smile faltered, confusion crossing his features before settling into something more complex. He leaned back, pulling his hand from hers. "Twins." His tone wasn't wonder, it was accusation. "Yes," she said, willing her voice to stay calm. "They're healthy, William. I thought you'd be healthy." He laughed, but it was a brittle, mirthless sound. "B. I just told you I'm moving up. This is the first real step toward becoming someone who matters in that world. And now you're telling me there will be 2 infants. They're our children, she said, her voice trembling despite herself. We can make it work. We're a team. No, he cut in sharply, standing so quickly, his chair scraped against the worn floorboards. We were never a team B. You were convenient someone to share rent with while I worked out of the grind. But you... His gaze swept over her like an inventory. Hair always undone. No social polish, the daughter of a public school teacher from nowhere. You were never going to fit. The words struck like cold steel, leaving her breathless. We've been together for 3 years. I put my degree on hold so you could... He reached into his briefcase, pulled out his checkbook, and scribbled quickly. The paper landed on the table between them. 5,000. That's enough for a clinic and 1 month's rent. Handle it quietly. Beatrice stared at the slip of paper without moving. It might as well have been a blade. I have an early meeting, he said, retrieving his coat. Please don't call me. And if you think about child support, I've got lawyers who'll make sure you regret it. The door shut with a finality that reverberated through the small apartment. For a long moment, the only sound was the refrigerator's hum. The roast chicken sat cooling on the table. The check lay untouched. She sank into the chair, one hand on her belly, the other covering her mouth to keep the sob from escaping. But the tears came anyway, hot, relentless, carving down her cheeks. In the dim light, she whispered to the 2 lives within her, I won't let you suffer. Not for him, not for anyone. Her eyes fell to the worn notebook on the counter. She flipped it open to the first page and wrote in steady, deliberate strokes, Day 1 for Noah and Amara. Outside, the city continued oblivious to when a woman decided to build an empire from nothing. Stories like Beatrice's remind us that sometimes the most beautiful victories begin in the quietest, most painful places. If her journey touched you, let us know your thoughts below. Share your stories of resilience or leave a word of encouragement. And if you'd like to follow where her path leads next, make sure to stay with us for the coming chapters. The next morning, the apartment was cold in a way beyond temperature. The gray light of early dawn pressed against the windows, hesitant and thin, as if it too didn't want to step inside. Beatrice sat at the kitchen table in the same sweater she'd worn the night before, her hair pulled back loosely. The roast chicken, untouched, still sat in its pan. The check William had left lay on the table, a stark slash of white paper against the faded wood. She had barely slept. Every time her eyes closed, she heard his voice again, clipped, final, the words so sharp they seemed to echo in her bones. Convenient. Not enough. They twisted inside her, like the chills seeping through the walls. A soft knock broke the silence. She opened the door to find Mr. Alvarez, her landlord, bundled in a worn leather jacket. His face was lined, but his eyes were kind. "My rent's 2 weeks late," he said gently, rubbing his gloved hands together. "I know you've been suitable for it before, but..." She held out the check, forcing a small smile. "Here, I'll deposit it today." Mr. Alvarez frowned, glancing at the memo line. "This is in your name, not mine, and it says medical procedure. I'll cash it and bring you the rent tomorrow," she murmured. After he left, she picked up the phone and called the bank. The hold music crackled for a minute before a voice came on the line. "Ma'am, there's a stop payment on that check placed yesterday evening." Her stomach dropped. She didn't speak. The phone line went silent except for her uneven breathing. When she finally hung up, she stood in the kitchen, one hand on her belly, the other gripping the counter's edge until her knuckles whitened. The twins shifted inside her, a faint rolling motion beneath her palm. It was as if they were answering her fear with their wordless plea. "Don't give up on us." Beatrice slid down to the cold linoleum, knees drawn up, forehead pressed against them. She let the tears come quiet at first, then harder, until her chest ached. In those moments, she allowed herself to grieve not just for the loss of William, but for the version of herself who had believed his promises. But grief was a luxury she could not afford. The rent was due. The savings account was almost empty. And in just a few months, she would have 2 mouths to feed besides her own. She pushed herself to her feet and crossed to the small desk in the corner, the one place in the apartment untouched by last night's wreckage. Her mother's photo sat in a simple wooden frame there. It was from a summer long past the two of them, on a park bench, sunlight tangled in her mother's braids. Her mother's hand rested over hers in the picture, as if sealing some quiet agreement. Beatrice spoke into the stillness. "You said I was born to survive storms, Mama. Well, here we are." She opened her worn notebook, the one she had started years ago for research notes and study schedules, and turned to a blank page. The ink from her pen bled dark and sure into the paper, Day 1, for Noah and Amara. She underlined the words twice, as though that alone could make them permanent. Then she began a list, half survival plan, half lifeline. Find work immediately. Seek housing assistance. Keep the baby safe at all costs. By mid-morning, the apartment felt too small, too heavy with the echo of what had happened. She dressed in jeans, pulled on a heavy coat, and wrapped a scarf around her neck. The air outside was brittle and cold, reaching past fabric and into your skin. She walked to the bus stop with slow, deliberate steps, the kind you take when trying not to think too far ahead. The other passengers stood with their collars up, breath rising in faint clouds. Beatrice held her bag close inside a folder with her identification, her resume from before she left university, and a small pouch of toiletries, things she thought she might need if she couldn't come home tonight. The bus ride downtown took her past the vast stretch of Lake Michigan, its winter-gray waves cresting in the distance. She pressed her forehead lightly to the glass, letting the view fill her with something close to calm. The wait was extended at the municipal assistance office, and the chairs were hard. When her number was called, she sat across from a caseworker who glanced at her form, his eyes pausing on the word twins. "There's a wait list for most programs," he said flatly. "It could be months." "Months," her voice cracked. "I don't have months. I'm due in early spring." He sighed, offering her a thin packet of shelters and food pantry addresses. "I wish I could do more." The shelters were worse than the list suggested, crowded, understaffed, and quick to turn her away once they saw her belly. "We can't handle high-risk pregnancies," one intake clerk told her without apology. By evening, her body ached from walking in the cold, her breath raw in her throat. She ended up in the public library, sinking into a chair near the heating vent. The warm air smelled faintly of old books and dust. She closed her eyes for the first time all day, resting her hands over her stomach. When she opened them again, a flyer from the bulletin board across the aisle caught her attention. It was printed on pale blue paper, the ink slightly smudged. "Receptionist wanted. Lakeshore Biotech. Immediate benefits. Flexible hours. No experience necessary." Her pulse quickened. She read it repeatedly, as if the words might vanish if she looked away. Immediate benefits. It meant doctor's visits. It meant prenatal vitamins. It meant she could breathe even for a little while. She copied the address carefully into her notebook, underlining it twice. Tomorrow she would go there. Tomorrow she would walk through that door no matter what they thought when they saw her belly. The sky was already dark when she left the library, and the wind was sharper now, cutting through the city streets. She pulled her scarf tighter, heading toward the nearest shelter on the list. They might turn her away, but she had to try. Her mind drifted back to the apartment, to the roast chicken still in the pan. She thought of how William hadn't even looked at it, or noticed the effort she'd made. For a moment, bitterness rose in her, hot and fierce, but she let it pass. There was no room in her new life for bitterness, only to resolve. When she reached the shelter, her cheeks burned from the cold. Inside, the air was heavy, and there was a smell of weak coffee and disinfectant. A woman at the desk looked her over, her gaze lingering on her belly. "First night?" she asked. Beatrice nodded. "Bunk in the back. 3 nights maximum. Then you'll have to move on." Beatrice murmured her thanks and followed the woman down a narrow hallway. The room was crowded, rows of bunks pressed close together. She found her bed, a narrow cot with a thin blanket, and sat down slowly, lowering herself with one hand braced on her knee. She lay on her side, pulling the blanket over her shoulders. The babies moved again, a soft flutter against her ribs. Her eyes traced the cracks in the ceiling, the faint water stains that mapped years of neglect. And yet, for all its flaws, the shelter was warm. For 3 nights at least, they would be warm. She closed her eyes, hearing her mother's voice again. "You were born to survive storms." "Yes," she whispered into the dimness. "But I'll do more than survive. I'll rise." And in that fragile, unguarded moment, the vow took root. Not a vow for revenge, not exactly, but a promise that William's dismissal and cruelty would become the fuel she needed to climb higher than he could imagine. Tomorrow, she would knock on the door of Lakeshore Biotech. Tomorrow, she would begin again. The morning began with frost. It clung stubbornly to the edges of the shelter's small window, its lacework catching the first thin light of day. Beatrice lay awake long before the bell for breakfast sounded, her eyes tracing the pale ceiling, as if the cracks themselves could tell her which way to go. The cot beneath her had grown familiar, strangely too short for comfort, the springs pressing against her back, but at least warm. She could hear the quiet breathing of the other women in the room, some murmuring in sleep, others already stirring. In the bunk above her, a young mother shifted the muffled sound of her baby's soft cries, breaking the fragile hush. Beatrice pushed herself upright carefully, her hand instinctively resting over the curve of her belly. Noah and Amara moved faintly beneath her palm, a small private reassurance that they were still there, still holding on. She thought of the blue flyer folded in her notebook, the address to Lakeshore Biotech written twice, for fear it might smudge. The bathroom mirror reflected a woman she didn't fully recognize. Cheeks, slightly hollow, eyes, darker than she remembered, the shadow of fatigue set deep. Still, she smoothed her hair back and tied it neatly, dabbing at her skin with the last moisturizer. Presentation mattered. She would not walk into that building looking like someone they could dismiss at a glance. After a breakfast of oatmeal thinned almost to water, she bundled herself in the same heavy coat she'd worn since college, its lining frayed, the buttons mismatched. Outside, the wind cut sharply against her face, and her breath lifted in pale clouds as she made her way to the bus stop. The streets of Milwaukee were still shaking off the night storefronts, locked sidewalks empty, except for the occasional bundled figure hurrying past. The bus arrived with a hiss of brakes, and she climbed aboard, clutching the handrail as the driver nodded her toward a seat. She sat by the window, watching the city unfold in muted tones, gray sky, bare trees, the faint glint of ice on the river. With each block, the neighborhoods shifted, brick walk-ups gave way to wider streets, lined with coffee shops and offices. Her reflection in the glass looked almost out of place against the backdrop of steel and glass. She reminded herself that she belonged anywhere she chose to stand. The bus dropped her 3 blocks from the address on the flyer. Lakeshore Biotech's building stood apart from its neighbors, not towering but precise. Red brick framed with tall, clean windows, the company name etched in silver across the glass entrance. The contrast to the world she'd lived in these past weeks was almost jarring. Beatrice paused outside the door, catching sight of her reflection in the pane. Her navy blouse had been washed carefully in the shelter's laundry room, but was still wrinkled from drying on a line. Her only shoes were worn at the edges, the soles soft from years of use. She took a slow breath, smoothing the blouse with her palms, tucking a stray curl behind her ear. "This is for you," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. She pressed her hand gently to her belly, imagining the twins listening. Inside, the air was warm and faintly scented with coffee and disinfectant. A security desk sat just beyond the entrance, where a man in a dark green uniform looked up from a clipboard. His name tag read, "George," and his expression was tired, but not unkind. She said, "I'm here to apply for the receptionist position," keeping her voice steady. George glanced at the worn paper she held, then pointed down a hallway room 104. "Ask for Mrs. Evelyn Carter." Her footsteps echoed softly against the polished floor as she walked. Room 104's door stood slightly ajar, revealing a modest office lined with file cabinets. Behind a desk, stacked with neatly arranged folders, sat a woman in her 50s, her gray-streaked hair pulled into a smooth bun. Wire-rimmed glasses framed sharp, assessing eyes. Beatrice Simon. The woman asked, her voice, even though it was not cold. "Yes, Mrs. Carter." Beatrice stepped forward, offering the resume she had printed at the public library the day before. The paper was thin, the ink slightly faded, but it was all she could manage. Evelyn glanced at it, her eyes catching on the line that read, "Masters in Biochemistry, University of Chicago." On hold. "You're overqualified for this role," Evelyn said plainly. "Why apply for a receptionist position?" Beatrice chose her words carefully. "Because it comes with health benefits. I'm expecting twins, and I need stability. I can learn quickly and will work harder than anyone you hire." The room was quiet for a moment, except for the faint ticking of a wall clock. Evelyn's gaze flickered to her belly, but there was no judgment, only consideration. "You've done lab work before?" she asked. "Yes. 2 years as a research assistant at the University of Chicago. I'm familiar with sample preparation, data analysis, and maintaining lab protocols." Her voice carried a thread of pride even now. "It's where I learned the kind of precision science demands." Evelyn tapped her pen against the desk. "We're short on lab assistants for the evening shift. If you can handle both reception by day and lab support at night, it pays more, and you'll have those benefits immediately. But it's demanding work." "I can handle it," Beatrice said without hesitation. "I've handled worse." A small, almost imperceptible smile touched Evelyn's lips. "Start tomorrow at 8. We'll order a uniform in your size." Beatrice blinked, the words settling over her like sunlight after weeks of cloud. She nodded, managing to keep her composure. "Thank you." As she stepped back into the cold, the wind felt different, brisk, but not biting. The street seemed brighter, and the noise of passing cars was less harsh. She walked to the bus stop with her coat pulled tight, the folded schedule Evelyn had given her clutched in one hand. This wasn't just a job. It was a doorway. Back at the shelter that night, she lay awake long after the room had gone quiet, the paper schedule under her pillow like a talisman. She thought of what the next day would bring. Phones ringing, files to manage, the hum of lab equipment, the faint chemical scent that clung to her memories of the university. She imagined herself in that space, not as a charity case, but as someone whose presence mattered. Someone building towards something greater. The baby shifted again, a subtle rhythm against her ribs. She closed her eyes and whispered into the darkness, "We're going to be all right." Somewhere deep inside, she felt the truth of it take root. The next morning, frost clung to the bare branches outside the shelter's narrow windows, casting fragile patterns against the pale winter light. Beatrice had been awake since before the alarm, lying in her bunk, and listening to the slow stir of the room around her, the soft shuffling of feet, the low murmur of a mother soothing her child, the hiss of water pipes reluctant to wake. Her coat felt heavier than usual as she buttoned it, not from the weight of the fabric, but from the awareness of what the day meant. She tucked the folded schedule Evelyn Carter had given her into the inside pocket close to her chest, as if proximity might anchor her resolve. The bus ride into the heart of Milwaukee felt longer than the day before. She watched the city shift from worn brick and corner bodegas to glass-fronted offices and cafes, spilling light onto the cold sidewalks. When she stood before Lakeshore Biotech's red brick facade, the air around her was alive with the crisp morning bite. Her breath rose in delicate clouds, each dispersing quickly into the blue. Through the tall front windows, she could see the lobby moving with quiet purpose. A young man in a white lab coat crossing with a stack of folders, a woman carrying a tray of coffee cups, her pace steady but unhurried. Inside, the warmth embraced her immediately, carrying the faint scent of roasted beans and something sterile, yet clean, the unmistakable tang of a place where science was at work. The polished floor reflected the muted glow of overhead lights, and the hum of the building seemed to wrap around her like a steady heartbeat. George, the security guard from yesterday, looked up from his clipboard and gave her a short nod of recognition. "Room 104, he said, as though he'd been expecting her. She followed the same hallway, her steps quieter this time, her pulse steady but quick. When she entered, Evelyn was already at her desk, a steaming cup of coffee near her right hand, her glasses perched low on her nose as she flipped through a stack of forms. "You're early," Evelyn remarked, not looking up immediately. But when her eyes did meet Beatrice's, there was no surprise, only a measured kind of approval. "Good. We start early here." Beatrice accepted the dark blue uniform, folded neatly on the desk, the fabric still holding the faint scent of laundry starch. She stepped into the small adjoining restroom, to change, smoothing the material over her curves, noting how it allowed room for the gentle swell of her pregnancy. When she caught her reflection in the mirror, something shifted inside her. Not vanity, but a quiet acknowledgement. She looked like she belonged here. The morning passed in a rhythm that felt both foreign and familiar. Evelyn showed her the reception desk, the multi-line phone system, the process for scheduling client meetings and routing calls to the research teams. The phone rang often, voices on the other end, clipped with efficiency or softened with polite warmth, and Beatrice found herself adapting quickly, her pen gliding over the notepad with an ease that surprised her. Between calls, she studied the faces moving through the lobby lab technicians, in their white coats, administrative staff with clipboards and tablets, researchers who seemed to carry the weight of discovery in their furrowed brows. Occasionally, someone's gaze would flicker to her belly, but there was no open hostility. Just curiosity, perhaps even mild surprise, that she was here at the front of their building, greeting visitors with an even voice and a steady smile. By late afternoon, Evelyn appeared at her side. "You'll have a break before the evening shift. I'll introduce you to Dr. Brooks in the lab." Her tone held no question. This was not a suggestion, but a step already decided. The lab was a world apart from the reception area. The air carried a faint sharpness, the hum of equipment blending with the rhythmic click of pipettes and the low murmur of scientists conferring over data sheets. Rows of glassware caught the light in delicate arcs, and the stainless steel counters gleamed under the bright overhead fixtures. Dr. Samuel Brooks was taller than she'd expected. His salt and pepper hair swept neatly back the lines on his face, deep but not unkind. He looked up from a set of printouts as Evelyn introduced them. "This is Beatrice Simon. Evelyn said she's joining us part-time as lab support in the evenings." Brooks's gaze was direct, but not probing. "Evelyn tells me you've worked in a lab before." "Yes," Beatrice replied, 2 years in biochemistry at the University of Chicago. "I handled sample preparation, ran assays, and maintained protocols." He studied her for a moment, then gestured to a workstation. "We'll start you on prep. Reagents need to be measured precisely, no shortcuts, no deviations. This isn't about speed, it's about accuracy." Her fingers felt sure as she began, the muscle memory returning like an old language she hadn't spoken in years. She measured, poured, and recorded each movement deliberate, each note carefully written. She could feel Brooks's gaze occasionally assessing, perhaps even testing her. When the shift ended, she cleaned her station thoroughly, ensuring every beaker and every pipette was returned exactly as they had been found. Brooks approached as she was hanging up her lab coat. "You work carefully," he said, his voice even. "We'll see how you handle more complex tasks next week." It wasn't effusive praise, but it was something a foothold. She nodded, not trusting herself to speak without revealing the quiet swell of pride in her chest. When she stepped back into the night, the city's air was sharper, the street lamps pooling light onto the damp sidewalks. She walked to the bus stop, with her hands deep in her coat pockets, the uniform folded neatly in her bag. Her feet ached, and her back twinged faintly from standing most of the day. But beneath the fatigue was something warmer, the faint pulse of purpose returning. At the shelter, she slid into her cot, the low murmur of the room around her fading into the background. She rested her hand on her belly, feeling the subtle shift of life beneath her palm. For the first time in weeks, she didn't feel like she was drifting. She was moving forward, one deliberate step at a time. And that, she thought, was enough for tonight. The hospital room was bright the way winter light can be, clean and unblinking, spilling across the polished floor and the silver rails of the bed. Beatrice lay half reclined, hair damp against her temples. Fingers curled around the sheet as the contraction eased. The monitor beside her gave a steady, complacent beep, as if it had all the time in the world. She did not. The twins had decided to arrive 5 weeks early, and there was a hum in the room, nurses crossing voices low that said everyone understood how delicate an early entrance could be. "You're doing beautifully," a nurse murmured, a black woman with a velvet voice and sure hands. Her name tag read, "Renee, 2 strong heartbeats. I'll be here the whole time." Beatrice nodded, breath-catching. She tried to anchor herself in the ordinary things, the tick of the clock, the linen's faint scent of starch, the way Renee's fingers pressed reassurance into the inside of her wrist. Beneath all of it was the rhythm of her body doing the oldest work it knew. When the first baby arrived, the room changed, the brief hush, the small, astonished cry, the nurse's wordless smile. "Noah," they said, and placed him where she could see him. His mouth a delicate bow, his fists outraged at the cold air, his lungs already declaring themselves. A minute later, Amara followed, lighter, fierce-eyed, her cry, a ribbon that braided itself around her brothers. Beatrice could only look, tears unmooring softly, as if the body that had fought so long to hold them had finally let itself be relieved. "They're early, but they're breathing well," Renee said, adjusting a tiny cap over Amara's soft hair. "You did well, Mama. Mama." The word settled somewhere deep, where a wound had been. Beatrice reached. Her fingers found Noah's palm. He closed around them, as if he had been looking for that shape. She whispered their names to them once, twice, as if the syllables might become a blessing stitched into the first fabric of their lives. 5 days later, the world was smaller and larger at once. Smaller. A 1-bedroom walk-up on the north side stairs that complained under the weight of the car seat. A crib someone's cousin had outgrown, a folding table that doubled as a desk, and a place to cut sandwich crusts. Larger 2 bassinets, 2 shadows on the wall, 2 sets of breathing to count when the street grew quiet. The taxi driver carried the car seat up the final flight and set it gently on the rug. "First time?" he asked. "Yes." Beatrice smiled, small but steady. "But I'll learn." At first, there were only the cycles, the clockwork of need. Feedings every 3 hours, diapers in an impossible parade, the mysterious sorcery of swaddles that kept coming loose. She kept a notebook with a careful grid time ounces sleep. She discovered how to do things with one hand and her shoulder warm a bottle fold. A blanket. Answer. A text from Evelyn checking on them. When fatigue pressed too hard at the corners of her vision, she sat on the floor and let the twins' breathing pull her back from the edge. At night, when both finally slept, she would sit in the dim glow of the lamp and watch their faces work through dreams, tiny expressions, a flicker of a smile that felt like grace. In those hours, it was easy to believe there was a map written across their foreheads that if she read it correctly, she would find the path out of scarcity and into a life that fit their names. 6 weeks passed. The hospital bills had been blunted by the insurance Lakeshore had given her. Evelyn had fought for 6 weeks of leave with a firmness that brooked no argument. "You'll be back when you're ready," she'd said, and had meant it. Ready, Beatrice discovered, is a flexible word. She returned because she had to, because the formula was expensive and rent exacting, because a purpose called to her like a voice through fog. But when she added the price of childcare to the numbers in her notebook, the math refused to solve. She went to Lakeshore with both babies anyway. She timed their feedings to the bus schedule, strapped the double stroller with a precision that had no margin for error, and walked into the glass-bright lobby with a diaper bag slung over her shoulder like a declaration. Evelyn's eyes widened, and then softened, one eyebrow rising in a question that was less judgment than worry. "You sure I can do both?" Beatrice said. "They sleep most of the day. I'll keep them away from the lab at night." There was a long beat in which the building seemed to hold its breath. Then Evelyn exhaled. 2 weeks. We'll try. If it jeopardizes safety or work, we reassess." Deal. They set the crib behind the reception desk, screened tastefully by a low divider and a potted ficus that Beatrice immediately grew protective of, as if the plant were a co-conspirator. She learned the choreography of the new life by noon, answering calls with a hand that could not be tremulous, flipping through calendars while a pacifier balanced expertly in the other. Visitors did double takes. Some smiled in surprise. A few frowned, brief and disapproving, and then forgot her seconds later. She rolled the stroller down the hall toward the lab in the evening heart vigilant. She had already taped out a small, no-footprint corner far from chemical benches, where a white noise machine hushed the sharpest sounds, and a thin curtain dimmed the glare. She disinfected surfaces with a devotion that would have made her university lab manager proud, and arranged the babies so that their faces turned toward the soft hum of the machine. The first time Dr. Samuel Brooks saw the makeshift nook, he said nothing momentarily. His eyes took it in the care, the planning, the audacity. "Does this meet safety policy?" he asked finally. "I spoke to compliance," she said. "They approved with conditions. I meet them." A pause and then a nod. "Then let's work." She prepped reagents with the exactitude she had promised and labeled vials as if handwriting itself could be a discipline. She moved like memory-made flesh formulas in her head, protocols in her bones. When Amara stirred, Beatrice found she could rock the stroller with the heel of her shoe and still pipette with perfect volume. A body could learn new balances. Balance is a verb. Not everyone appreciated the physics of her days. Paul Henson's shoulders squared with a self-importance that mistook volume for weight peered at the curtain. "Professional," he said dryly. "Bring your babies to work week now permanent." Beatrice did not flinch. "The work is done correctly," she said, and turned back to her bench. "Let the results speak," Brooks said later, not exactly to her, but not to the room either. His gaze touched down on a row of clean data points. "You hit the numbers." Still, there was a night when the order broke. Noah grew warm in her arms, eyelids heavy in a way that did not look like sleep. She pressed her cheek to his forehead and felt the heat that shifted grit into her veins. The thermometer's thin digital voice said what she already knew. She called Evelyn from the hallway, voice low. "I need to take them home. I can come back later midnight, finish the prep." "No," Evelyn said, a firmness that held and held. "Your child is the priority. We need you long term, not just tonight. Text me in the morning." Beatrice hung up with her throat tight. The bus ride home was a narrow tunnel, every light a minor miracle of arrival. In the apartment, she undressed Noah to his diaper, bathed his temples in cool cloth, murmured through the fever's lift and fall, as if her voice could smooth the jaggedness. By dawn, his breathing had slowed into something ordinary again, the numbers receding into a harmless blue. She slept, sitting up for an hour with both twins in the soft trench of her arms, and woke to sunlight making honest rectangles on the floor. At work the following evening, there was no speech, no announcement. She set the stroller in its corner and measured the first solvent line into a clean beaker. Brooks drifted over at some point, hands in lab coat pockets. "He said you work like you've been here a decade without preamble. When you're ready, we'll talk about training beyond prep." She nodded once, because anything more would have cracked the perfect surface she needed to keep. Days gathered. She cut costs with a discipline that felt like art learned, which grocery store discounted formula after 8, which pharmacy clerk would slip an extra sample of lotion into a bag, how to cook a single pot of soup in a way that tasted different 3 days in a row. At home, she taped a small sign above the crib in handwriting that belonged on lab labels. "We are stronger than every storm." She traced the letters with her finger each morning, as if she could press the promise deeper into the wall. When she returned to the lab with the twins asleep, Paul's commentary thinned. Data has a way of silencing what opinions cannot. Notes from clients began to mention the neatness of her scheduling and the reliability of her follow-up. A researcher left a folded thank you beside the reception phone for catching an error in a meeting invite that would have wrecked an entire day. The twins found each other's hands at night and held on. There were moments when fatigue pressed until the room went gray at the edges. She learned to stand still and breathe until the edges came back. She knew that love can be an engine when fuel is thin. She knew the music of 2 tiny voices from the other room and how to finish a calculation without losing their melody. On a wind-clear evening, she left the lab late and paused outside under the sharp points of starlight. In the stroller, Noah exhaled in that soft surrender babies do when sleep has finally won. Amara turned her face toward the zipper of Beatrice's coat, as if the metal itself were a constellation. The night cracked open, cold, honest, precise, yet she felt warm, as if something inside had knit itself together while she was not looking. She realized this was not a balancing act performed over a void. It was a bridge being built in small spans, call by call, vial by vial, hour by hour, across a gap she had once thought uncrossable. The distance behind her no longer frightened her. The distance ahead began at last to look like a way forward. By late winter, the lab had its own weather centrifuges, humming like low wind across metal compressors, exhaling in patient intervals, glassware, catching the light and returning it in quiet fragments. Beatrice had learned the rhythm of the room, the way sailors learn a coast, where the currents pooled, where the hazards lay, which benches you could lean on, and which demanded a precise distance. By day, she guided visitors at reception, with the poise of someone who knew which doors would open. By night, she stepped into the white brightness of the lab and let her hands remember what they loved. Noah and Amara were nearly 3 months old and slept in the small cordoned corner she had made, the thin curtains softening the glare and the white noise machine smoothing the edges of sound. When she worked, she kept them in her peripheral vision, like you keep stars, not always seen, always known. The sign above their travel crib, We are stronger than every storm had begun to feel less like a hope and more like a plan, written in steady script. The antiviral line was steady work. Lakeshore's protocol was a binder made of habit and caution, the pages annotated by years of minor adjustments. Measure reagent A at room temperature. Bring to 42 degrees. Add catalyst B at 2%. Mass, stabilize compound, and verify. Repeat. The numbers were good enough to be respectable, never good enough to be a story. On a Tuesday that felt too long, Beatrice paused with a pipette and watched the pale yellow swirl in a beaker that looked innocent as tea. She checked the yield calculation she'd written in the margin of her notebook, 25% of raw material lost, predictable as a tide. She turned the page and found an old formula from the University of Chicago, her notes dense and small, a version of herself who still believed the shortest distance between understanding and change was courage. If the reaction started at 5 degrees cooler and the catalyst ratio came down to 1.7, maybe 1.6, the system might bind cleaner. Lower temperature, slower kinetics, less waste. It was a thought that didn't ask permission, only competence. She rocked Amara's stroller once with the heel of her shoe and checked the monitors. Both twins sank in the warm dark of infant sleep. The clock near the autoclave showed 9:40. Her shift ended at 10. The building drained by 11. If she stayed an hour more, she could run a test small enough to be harmless, big enough to tell the truth. Please don't make this about speed, Dr. Brooks had said when she started. Make it about accuracy. She decided accuracy included seeing whether a known inefficiency had a better answer. Beatrice set up a side tray labeled in thick, careful letters as trial do not use, and prepped a micro batch that would offend no ledger if it failed. She chilled reagent A by 5 degrees, watching the thermometer like you watch a promise. She adjusted the catalyst to 1.6, logged every change, set a timer, and folded her arms so she would not pace away the minutes. When the reaction completed, she filtered, compounded, and slid the sample into the spectrometer with hands that refused to tremble. The instrument's screen washed itself in numbers, then stabilized. She copied them down and checked the math twice, as if certainty were a garment that fit better when tried more than once. Yield up 19.8%. Purity unchanged. Waste reduced. The room did not applaud. The centrifuge kept its low hum, but the air around her shifted the way a room shifts when a door has been opened somewhere you can't see. She looked at the stroller, 2 small bodies curved into themselves, and thought, I think we have a foothold. At 10:57, she closed her notebook and reset the space as if she had never been there. The extra hour would come out of sleep. She would take it back later with gratitude. In the morning, she was back at the front desk with a steady voice and a pen that filled boxes neatly. At 11, she knocked once on Dr. Brooks's office door and held out the notebook like a petition. I ran a controlled microtest after hours, she said. Lowered the initial temperature by 5 degrees. Dropped the catalyst ratio to 1.6. Yield increased 19.8%. Purity maintained. I logged each step. Brooks took the book and did not sit. His eyes moved quickly, then slowly, then stopped. You did this on your own, he said. Not quite a question. I did, she replied, forcing her voice to stay even. It's outside my scope. If that's a problem, I'll accept the consequences. But the data warranted a look. He turned the page, finding her calculations dense and tidy. It warrants a pilot, not a reprimand, he said after a moment. We'll reproduce this with QA and 2 technicians. If we confirm your numbers at scale, you will have saved us. He did the math in his head and nodded to himself. You'll have saved us real money. Time 2, she said. Less rework. He gave the smallest smile there and gone. Time 2. The pilot happened fast because necessity is a ruthless project manager. On Thursday afternoon, Brooks assembled a small team, Paul Henson from Synthesis Maria from QA. Beatrice on prep, and stood at the edge of the bench like a judge who prefers evidence to rhetoric. Paul's expression had the polished neutrality of someone waiting to dislike a thing. He said that protocol deviations usually come back to bite arranging glassware with a noise that wasn't quite gentle. Then we'll keep it small, Brooks said. And if it bites me. They measured the cooled reagent. They dialed the catalyst down. They ran the sample twice. Maria read the spectrometer lips moving over the numbers before she spoke them out loud. The yields held. The purity held. The waste dropped in a way that made the line graph look like it had finally learned restraint. Again, Brooks said, because fundamental changes demand patience. On the third run, the numbers shifted a fraction, and then stilled, as if settling into the shape they'd been meant to have all along. Paul set down his pipette with a careful clack. Huh, he said, which in his mouth was enormous. When the pilot concluded, Brooks leaned against the bench and exhaled. He was not a man who smiled broadly, but approval softened him. We'll write this up and lock it, he said, and we'll give credit where it's due. Paul's glance slid sideways, catching on Beatrice's belly, and then away, as if he couldn't quite decide which part of her to resent. Some people get to skip steps, he muttered low enough to be deniable. Beatrice was tired enough to say nothing. Maria wasn't. Some people take them, she said, her tone mild as glass. The memo went company-wide the next week. Process optimization. Antiviral lines signed by Brooks, with a single line near the end that mattered more than the logo at the top. The method was adapted from a trial designed and executed by B. Simon. It was not poetry, but truth in ink, and truth, she had learned, is the only currency that keeps its value. Evelyn found her at reception late that afternoon and set a mug beside the keyboard tea, not coffee, with a thin slice of lemon floating like a small sun. He told me, she said. Beatrice covered the mug with her palm, letting the heat travel into her cold fingers. She said it wasn't just me, because that was also true. Humility is lovely, Evelyn replied, and you can practice it on your own time. In this building, we also practice attribution. When the lab quieted that evening, Brooks called her into his office. The blinds were half open, and winter light lay across the filing cabinet in silver bands. He gestured to a chair, but did not sit himself, as if the news needed his spine. He said, "We run an internal training program for technicians who want to move toward research. It's long, not glamorous work, but the slope leads to the benches where decisions get made. You know that slope." She did. She could see it the way you see a hill you've already climbed once steep, real possible. "I'd like you in the next cohort," Brooks said. "We'll adjust your hours so you don't break. I can't promise anything except more work and more learning. But you've already proved you can carry both." For a moment, she heard only the sound of the building air moving, something clicking down the hall. She thought of the sign over the travel crib. She thought of Paul's mutter of Maria's small defense. She thought of Evelyn's tea, Mr. Alvarez's worn jacket, and the bus that carried her past the Iron River mornings when the city still had frost at its lips. "Yes," she said, "I want in." Brooks nodded, once the kind of nod that concludes a contract. "Good. Bring the notebook from your trial. We'll start with why you thought of lowering the temperature." She finished the evening preparing her station with a care that felt like gratitude made visible. When she wheeled the stroller toward the door, Amara stirred and sounded like a question. Beatrice touched her daughter's cheek, and then Noah's answering in a language that needed no words. Outside, the air had thinned into a bright cold, making the street lamps look closer. She tightened the blanket around the twins and started for the bus, the city a map she was learning in deeper ink. The binder of protocols would change next week, and a small sentence would carry her name. It would not make the rent easier or the nights shorter, but it would place a stone where a step had been missing. A well-set small stone can hold a bridge's weight. Spring arrived in New York like a secret whispered from tree to tree, first in the faint gloss on the branches, then in the stubborn daffodils pushing through the soil outside Lakeshore's glass facade. Inside, the air was no warmer, but something in Beatrice's days had begun to thaw. Her promotion into the internal training program was not a sudden leap, but a steady climb. Twice a week after her front desk hours ended, she swapped her blazer for a lab coat and joined a small cohort in the corner meeting room that smelled faintly of ethanol and fresh paper. They learned advanced protocols, molecular modeling, and troubleshooting material she had once touched during her master's studies, now rediscovered like a language half-remembered. It was not easy. The twins were 5 months old and had learned the art of unpredictability. Some nights, Noah decided that sleep was for lesser mortals. Others, Amara developed a taste for her mother's attention at impossible hours. There were evenings she arrived at the training session, with her hair pulled hastily back, the faintest smear of formula on her cuff, and eyes that burned from too little rest. But she absorbed each lesson with a hunger that surprised even her. Her notes became meticulous maps of the process reaction pathways, shaded in pencil key steps, circled in blue ink margins, filled with questions to answer later. Dr. Brooks often lingered over her shoulders, saying little, but occasionally tapping the edge of her page in a way that felt like quiet approval. During one of these late sessions, she found herself working alongside Maria. The other woman was precise, quick with her hands, and not given to wasting words. Yet a steadiness in her presence reminded Beatrice of Evelyn, someone who recognized competence and did not begrudge it. "You have the reflexes for this work," Maria observed one evening, her voice low as she measured a reagent. "Reflexes?" Beatrice asked, glancing over. Maria said to know when to trust the numbers and when to trust your hands. Some people only learn the first. You already have both. Beatrice smiled faintly, unsure whether it was a compliment or a warning. "I had to," she said. "When you're alone with 2 babies, you learn fast what you can't afford to get wrong." Maria didn't ask further questions, but something in her gaze softened. The more she learned, the more she saw where processes could bend toward efficiency. Not every suggestion could be acted on. Lakeshore was still a company bound by regulations. But Brooks began to bring her into small project meetings, letting her speak when she had insight. It was a quiet kind of sponsorship that could go unnoticed if you weren't looking for it. She noticed. She kept her gratitude private, storing it in the same place she kept her determination. Brooks called her into his office one Thursday afternoon before her lab session. The blinds were open this time, sunlight spilling across his desk in a bright geometry. "There's a conference next month in Boston," he said. "Mid-level researchers, biotech process optimization. One of the panels is on manufacturing efficiency. I've been asked to speak." Beatrice nodded, unsure where this was leading. Brooks continued, "I'd like you to present your antiviral yield optimization as part of my talk. 10 minutes. You'll handle the technical portion. I'll handle the corporate context." Her first instinct was to say no. Public speaking was not foreign to her. Graduate school had demanded presentations, but this felt different. This was a room of professionals, many of whom would see only her youth, her gender, her skin, her history, written in the way she carried herself. But then she thought of the memo with her name on it, the data she had verified, the long nights she had turned into progress. "I'll do it," she said. Brooks's nod was slight, but there was satisfaction in it. "We'll prepare together. The story matters as much as the numbers. The weeks leading up to the conference were a blur. She practiced after the twins were asleep, standing in the narrow living room with the slides on her laptop speaking to the shadows on the wall. She timed her sentences to match the graphs, trained herself to pause after key points. When she caught her rehearsing at the desk during lunch breaks, Evelyn would wave a hand and say, "Slower. Let them follow you. You've lived this now. Make them believe it." The night before Boston, she lay out her navy dress and low heels pressed her notes until the pages felt warm. Noah fussed through part of the night. Amara woke just before dawn, and Beatrice packed bottles and diapers alongside her laptop, as if the two belonged in the same bag. Evelyn had arranged for a part-time sitter, a retired nurse named Mrs. Dalton, to stay with the twins during the day. The conference hotel was glass and steel, its lobby filled with the low murmur of conversation and the rustle of lanyards. White screens glowed with presentation titles in the main hall, and the smell of coffee drifted in waves. Brooks was calm beside her, reviewing the opening of his remarks. When it was her turn, she walked to the lectern with her notes in hand, the room settling into a polite quiet. She began with the problem, the yield loss, the waste percentages, the bottleneck in production, and moved to the solution with the precision she had rehearsed. She saw a few heads tilt forward as she described lowering the reaction temperature, adjusting the catalyst ratio, and the following gains. When she finished, there was a brief silence, then a ripple of nods. A man in the second row raised his hand to ask about scalability. She answered, drawing on the pilot data, keeping her voice even. By the time she sat down, her pulse had slowed to something close to normal. Brooks leaned toward her just enough to say, "You did well." The presentation became a small story in New York that traveled through the building. Maria stopped her in the lab to say, "I heard you held your own." Paul, in his way, offered a curt nod when they passed in the hallway, which from him was almost an apology. It was a victory, but she didn't linger on it too long. There was always the next step, the following experiment to prepare the next skill to learn. She still had bills that didn't care how well she'd spoken in Boston twins, who cared only that she was present. One night after the twins were asleep, she sat at the small table with her notebook open. She began a new page, writing the date at the top. Underneath, in careful letters, she wrote, 10-year plan. She listed goals in no particular order. Complete training program. Earn a research lead role. Secure stable home ownership. Begin college fund for Noah and Amara. Publish in a peer-reviewed journal. Halfway down the page, she hesitated, then added one more. Surpass William Brown. The name sat there black on white, sharp as glass. She didn't need to explain it to herself. The measure was not just financial. It was about building something tangible that would last, something he could never claim to have made. When she closed the notebook, the night felt calmer, clearer. She checked on the twins one last time, adjusting their blankets, watching their small chests rise and fall. In the quiet, she understood this wasn't revenge she was building. It was a life. One day when she reached the horizon, she could barely see. She wanted them to know she had carried them toward it, she could barely see up. By early summer, the ceaseless brightness, when the air is warm enough to soften tempers, but still sharp enough to keep you moving. Beatrice's days fell into their demanding pattern front desk in the morning training, or lab work in the evening, the twins' unpredictable hours threading themselves through everything, like an uninvited but necessary refrain. At Lakeshore, the antiviral line was scaling up production. Her optimization trial had been adopted company-wide, and for the first time, she was allowed to oversee a segment of the workflow herself, a narrow slice, but one with enough moving parts to demand her full attention. Maria worked beside her some evenings, offering a quiet kind of camaraderie. The trouble began on a Wednesday. She was halfway through an equipment check when she noticed an anomaly in the data log, a minor spike in temperature, that had been smoothed over in the official report. It could be nothing, a sensor glitch or a sign of instability in the reaction that left unchecked would cascade into batch failure. She found Paul leaning against the counter scrolling through his phone while a centrifuge purred at his back. "Have you seen this?" she asked, turning her notebook toward him. He glanced at it. "Yeah." It corrected itself, no big deal. "It's a deviation," she said evenly. "We're supposed to stop and investigate." Paul's shrug was almost theatrical. "We'd lose half a day shutting that down. Brooks is already riding us on throughput." "This isn't about throughput," she said, her voice low but firm. "If it destabilizes, we lose the whole batch." His eyes flicked to her belly, still a gentle curve despite the twins' birth, and then back up his smirk thin. "You're not running this line. Please don't make it your hill to die on." Her jaw tightened, but she said nothing. Instead, she crossed to the terminal and pulled up the live feed. The readings were stable now, but the margin was uncomfortably narrow. She could feel the choice hardening in front of her: say nothing, and pray the numbers held, or step out of the chain of command and take responsibility for the slowdown herself. In the end, the decision wasn't about pride. It was about risk and the knowledge that the loss wouldn't just be monetary if the batch failed. It would ripple through schedules, push deliveries back, and delay hospital shipments. She called Brooks. He arrived within minutes, still in his suit from an upstairs meeting. She explained quickly, showing him the log and the sensor's behavior. He studied the screen, then her face. "You're right to flag it," he said finally. Paul shut it down. "Full diagnostics." Paul's muttered curse was almost lost under the sound of the machinery winding down. The diagnostics revealed a minor but spreading calibration error in the temperature control module. Left unchecked, it would have degraded the reaction slowly enough to evade notice until the yield collapsed. Brooks gave her a look in the lab that night, brief, almost imperceptible, but sufficient to carry meaning. The following morning, Evelyn leaned against the reception desk during a lull. "Heard you saved the batch," she said. Beatrice shook her head. "Just did what anyone would have done." Evelyn's smile was faint but knowing. "Not anyone. Some people see a crack and think it's just the paint. Others know it's the wall shifting." That weekend with his twins at Mrs. Dalton's, Beatrice took the rare luxury of walking through Central Park alone. The air smelled faintly of lilac, and the lake caught the sunlight in fractured silver. She thought of the moment she'd seen the data spike, of the quiet weight of the choice she'd made. She also thought unexpectedly of William Brown. It had been nearly a year since she'd last seen him. In her memory, he was still tall, immaculate, in the kind of suit that looked hand-stitched, for his frame still carrying that air of untouchable ease. But now, when she imagined standing before him, the imbalance she'd once felt wasn't there. She had been building something of her own, fragile still, but real. The thought didn't feel like revenge. It felt like distance. 2 weeks later, Brooks stopped by her station in the lab. "Got a minute?" She followed him to his office. He closed the door, an unusual step for their conversations. He said, "An opening is coming up, temporary lead for the evening shift on the antiviral line. 6 weeks. The current lead is on medical leave." She blinked. "You want me to step in? I think you're ready," he said. "And you've already proved you'll make the hard calls." Her mind jumped immediately to the twins, the longer hours, and the logistics. But beneath that, there was something steadier, a sense that this was one of those moments you don't delay for comfort. "I'll do it," she said. The first week in the lead role tested her in ways the training program never had. The work was less about her precision and more about holding the shape of the whole line, catching missteps before they grew, keeping schedules intact, managing personalities that resisted being managed. Paul was on her shift, his reluctance to take direction obvious but contained. Maria was her quiet ally, stepping in without being asked when tensions rose. On the 4th night, an unexpected supply delay threatened to throw off the batch schedule. She spent an hour on the phone with procurement and then reorganized the workflow so that prep work could continue in parallel. By morning, the delay had been absorbed with no loss. When Brooks reviewed the shift's output at the end of the week, he said, "You kept it moving. That's the job." But in his eyes, there was something more, a recognition that she had stepped into a larger space and not been crushed by it. One evening near the end of her temporary lead period, she stayed late to finish logging reports. The building was almost silent, the hum of the lab equipment like a distant engine. She'd just set her pen down when Maria appeared in the doorway. "You'll be taking this permanently," Maria said. Beatrice shook her head. "It's just for 6 weeks." Maria's smile was small, almost sly. "That's how they start. You'll see." After Maria left, Beatrice sat for a while in the quiet. Through the glass wall, she could see the benches where she had first stood in borrowed gloves, careful not to take up too much space. Her notebook sat open before her, filled with notes, adjustments, and quiet decisions that had kept the work moving. She thought again of that word horizon and felt the map of her life shift, the lines redrawing themselves with each choice she made. And somewhere beyond the edges of her daily battles and small victories, she sensed the fault lines of her past life beginning to stir. She didn't know yet that they would lead her straight back into the path of the man she had left behind, only that she was ready now, in a way she had not been before, to meet whatever came without stepping back. The summer air waited beyond the glass doors, carrying the faint sound of the city at night. She closed her notebook, switched off the desk lamp, and walked toward it, steady in her steps, already thinking of the next day's work. Night pooled softly in the corners of the apartment, a velvet hush broken only by the twins' steady breathing. Beatrice sat at the kitchen table, with a magazine she hadn't meant to bring home, the pages glossy enough to pretend at permanence. On the cover, William Brown stood at a midtown gala, a glass lifted at shoulder height, a woman with lacquered hair at his side. The caption spelled out fortunes and futures in the bright grammar of power. He looked untouched by time, Taylor, perfect gaze certain. She allowed the old ache to arrive for a long moment, looked around, and found nowhere to sit. Then she closed the magazine and slid it to the bottom of the stack of mail, like a photograph you keep only as proof of what you survived. On the first page of her notebook, she wrote in ink that did not waver, 10-year plan. Then the lines to hang a life upon are to complete the training program, earn a researcher's post, publish, save, invest, and build a home that would never remember the sound of an eviction notice. She paused, then added one more outlast hymn. Not as a flame thrown backward, but a vow spoken to the horizon. Time did not leap so much as it accreted. Days layered until they were years, each pressed into the next by minutes of work that left no fingerprints. The twins learned laughter, then words, questions with edges. Beatrice learned to braid their mornings into her nights, make recipes that multiplied, and find the rhythm where love could be inefficient and never once feel like less. At Lakeshore, the slope she had been promised turned into a staircase. The internal program gave way to a badge that read, Research Associate, then Senior Associate. She learned to run not just a bench, but a budget, hold a meeting steady when egos crowded the table, and retrieve a quiet room from the brink with numbers and gentleness in equal measure. Brooks's mentorship remained what it had always been, a steady hand at her back that felt more like weather than rescue. The twins were 7 when the bad news arrived. It came in daylight in a boardroom that smelled of coffee just poured and plans just broken. The screens at the head of the table were blue with loss, the kind of corporate blue that promised calm and delivered the opposite. Neurovita, a program that had eaten 3 years of hope and $80 million, had failed phase 3. In some patients, it had flickered like a miracle. In others, it had gone mysteriously dull. The effect size crumbled under the weight of inconsistency. The CFO spoke in a voice designed for unpleasant numbers. 4 months of runway. A sale to preserve value. Words like process and strategic options parachuted and never quite landed. Beatrice listened with her hands folded and her breath steady, and felt oddly, not panic, but a clean, cold quiet, the kind you get when you've stepped into winter water and your body stops insisting this cannot be done. When the meeting ended in an orderly fear, she gathered her papers and did not leave. The room, relieved of witnesses, exhaled. She opened Neurovita's dataset, the thing that had been a kind of scripture, and was suddenly a eulogy, and began to read it as if for the first time. The problem, she knew, was not always where the noise was loudest. Sometimes it hid in the line that everyone believed they understood. The efficacy graph refused to hold its shape, but in a secondary outcome, vascular markers taken dutifully, almost as an afterthought, she felt the small quake of a pattern microvascular flow, endothelial repair, and a recovery arc that did not care whether cognition had budged. The brain had shrugged. The blood had listened. She reran the filters and pulled half a dozen patient profiles that had produced nothing in the primary and something in the secondary. The curves repeated themselves with the agreeable arrogance of truth. It wasn't neurology that wanted this molecule. It was the heart, the vessels, the fragile roads inside us that carried our days to where they needed to be. Her first call was to Brooks. He came without coat or preamble. Read over her shoulder in silence, then in a low voice said, "Cardio. It's a different trial, different endpoints, a different world." "Where the drug is already pointing," she answered. "It wants to repair the vasculature." "We've been asking the wrong question." His gaze flicked through the numbers again, then to the window as if the glass might offer corroboration. "We'd need time we do not have. Money we do not have." He paused. "Permission we will not get." She closed the laptop gently, like a sleeping child, "unless we buy ourselves both." Brooks did not laugh. He sat and folded his hands, and for a long moment neither spoke. "You're proposing an employee buyout," he said finally, "in a company that is on paper already a cautionary tale. I'm proposing we stop being paper." Her voice did not rise. "I'm proposing that the people who did the work get the chance to keep it alive in the form it asks to be." He rubbed his jaw, the gesture of a man whose face had learned thinking. "How much can you put in?" She said 150,000, and felt the number leave her like a pulled thread. It was 7 years of quiet discipline. Soup that became 3 meals, shoes resold instead of replaced, and saying no to wants in service to a promise. It was also every margin she had built between her children and the world. "You'd risk that," he said without inflection. "I'd risk myself," she answered. "I won't risk them. So I'd only do it if we have a real plan." They built one in the hours everyone else used for sleep, repurposed to cardiovascular indications. Pilot studies were designed to prove the mechanism that was already whispering. A manufacturing refit that would not bankrupt them while they were still naming themselves. A legal map drawn with the caution of people who know empires have lawyers like weather systems. Evelyn came in on a Saturday with a thermos of soup and a binder of policies, her hair pinned with the precision of a woman who had learned to hold things together that did not want to be held. She read the plan without blinking, then set down the pages and said, "I have 250. I'd been saving for a cottage on a lake I'd probably never sit beside. Let's build a company instead." Maria nodded when they told her. 30, she said. "Not much, but I'll stand in every other way." Paul harumphed, then surprised himself by offering 20, a man making amends without words. Others drifted forward with smaller sums and larger loyalty. It was not enough. It was also more than Beatrice had thought she could ask. Banks were sterner. Spreadsheets wiped the courage from faces. On the third rejection, She almost let the ache under her ribs speak in the walk home that late afternoon. But when she picked up Noah from his math club and Amara from her debate practice, both children leaned into her with the absent trust of those who have never had to wonder where the next hour will sleep. She understood with the clarity of a blade that she had already made her choice. In the small hours, when the apartment belonged to the refrigerator's hum and the city's faraway pulse, she opened her notebook again. The page that had once held a 10-year plan now held a different geometry. Names linked by arrows, smaller circles around larger ones, lines drawn not as barriers, but as bridges. Simon Healthcare Innovations. A phrase she wrote once then again, to see how it looked in stubborn ink. On the last night before the board would entertain offers, she stood at the bedroom doorway and watched the twins sleep. Noah's hand had found Amara's in an old choreography. Their fingers made a small knot that would not come undone even in dreams. The sight landed in her like a benediction. At her table again, she gathered the pledges, the letters of intent, the bare-boned loan offer from a neighborhood bank that had decided after 3 meetings and 1 impossible spreadsheet to believe them. She slid her cashier's check to the packet's front as if it were a keystone. The next day, when the conference room filled with men who wore their certainty like cologne, she did not look for William Brown in any of their faces. She looked at Brooks and Evelyn, at Maria, in a blouse too bright for such a gray room, at her rough-knuckled hands folded on a stack of papers that could be the scaffolding of a future. Their bid, imperfect, deliberate, was placed on the long table with the quiet ceremony of a promise kept. Outside, the city glinted with its usual indifference. A thin wind came up from the river, cleaned the sky of smoke, and made the glass of the building's facade play at being water. Beatrice stood with her palm pressed lightly against that cold skin, and felt beneath it the faint machinery of something beginning. It was not a victory. It was not safe. It was a door unlatched. Behind her, the elevator chimed. She turned with the reflex of someone who has learned that turning is often the difference between losing and finding, and came face to face with a man whose shadow she had once mistaken for shelter. William Brown's tie was perfect. His surprise was not. For a breath, the past and the possible stood exactly 1 step apart. "Beatrice," he said softly, as if the name itself might change a tide. Her heart made no scene. "Mr. Brown." She answered, her voice so level, even the air seemed to listen. "We're in the middle of something." He glanced toward the conference room doors, toward the lives stacked like paper behind them, and she watched him understand that the center of gravity had moved across the room, all the way across the years, to the place where she was standing. She did not wait for his reply. The elevator opened again. Evelyn Brooks, a lawyer with earnest eyes, and Beatrice stepped between them into the light that buildings save for their thresholds, where every step means a different day is beginning. The boardroom was a theater of measured voices and concealed stakes. Around the long table, suits leaned over numbers that could tilt a company's fate in an afternoon. Beatrice sat between Brooks and Evelyn, her pen poised, but still the packet of their bid resting before her like a heartbeat she could see. William Brown's presence was not an accident. His company's logo gleamed from the corner of his presentation slides, a reminder of the empire he had built and the reach he could extend with a single nod. He was here for the same reason she was, to take what Lakeshore had become and bend it toward his vision. When he spoke, the air seemed to still. His proposal was elegant, backed by capital that dwarfed every other offer. The board members nodded, as if swayed by inevitability. He spoke of maximizing assets and streamlining operations, but Beatrice heard the unspoken truth. Neurovita's remains would be absorbed into something so vast they would cease to have a name. Then it was her turn. She rose without fuss, placing both hands on the table, not to steady herself, but to anchor her words. She didn't open with numbers, though they were ready. She opened with patience. She told the board about the vascular repair data, the overlooked signals, the line of possibility that shimmered when you looked closely enough. She spoke of keeping the work alive for the people it could still serve, of preserving the very reason Lakeshore had begun. She did not plead. She invited. The room didn't exhale until she sat. Brooks's hand brushed her sleeve in quiet approval. Evelyn's eyes held the kind of pride that needed no expression. Across the table, William's gaze found hers, having there a fraction longer than courtesy demanded. The vote was not swift, but it was decisive. The board awarded the sale to Simon Healthcare Innovations, contingent on financing that now, with the approval, would come from sources that had turned them away. When the gavel of decision fell, there was no applause. Just the low murmur of conversations shifting toward logistics. Yet inside her, a door she had been pushing against for years swung open, without resistance. That night, Beatrice walked home through the city's pulse, the air soft with the promise of rain. The streets shone under the lamps, and the smell of damp concrete rose around her like something familiar. She thought of every hour that had led here, every compromise, every refusal to step back, every quiet risk no one saw. At home, the twins waited on the couch, their eyes bright with the thrill of being awake past bedtime. "Did you win?" Noah asked, before she'd even taken off her coat. She crouched between them, one arm around each small, eager frame. "We get to keep it," she said. "We get to make it ours." Amara's smile was slow, thoughtful. "So you're the boss now?" Beatrice laughed softly. Something like that. But the truth felt larger than the title. She was no longer standing at someone else's door waiting to be let in. She held the keys, now heavy, real, and hers. 2 days later, William asked to see her. Not in the boardroom, not through lawyers. In person. They met in the glass atrium of a hotel near the park, the air fragrant with lilies arranged for some wedding later that evening. He looked the same, still immaculate, still carrying himself like a man accustomed to winning, but there was a shade of caution in how he approached her. "You fought well," he said, his voice low enough to be almost gentle. "I fought for what mattered," she replied. His gaze lingered as if he were searching for the woman he had once known. Perhaps he saw her, but with edges sharper now, light in places that had once been shadow. "You could still take my offer," he said. "Merge, grow faster, and lose what makes it worth growing." She shook her head. "No, William. This time I'm not trading the roots for the leaves." He studied her for a long moment, then nodded once slowly. "Then I hope you make it," he said. And somehow she believed him. They parted without promises, without lingering looks. Just two lives that had crossed in fire and were now moving at last in their directions. Autumn brought work without pause. There were contracts to finalize, lab spaces to reconfigure, and a new trial protocol to design. Beatrice built a leadership team from those willing to risk the lean months with her. Brooks took the role of director of research. Evelyn ran operations with the calm of someone who could stop a storm by speaking to it. Every evening she returned to the apartment where her children's laughter was the anchor she hadn't known she'd needed until it was hers. On weekends, they visited the riverside where Amara sketched leaves, while Noah tried to skip stones as far as the bend. These hours were not the margins of her life. They were the center. And in quiet moments, late at night at her desk, or walking home past windows lit with strangers' dinners, she felt a thread running through it all. Not luck, not destiny, but the deliberate weaving of choices that had brought her here. She had stood in the ruins of what she thought she'd needed, building something better from the remaining pieces. When the first results from their cardiovascular trial came back, showing a measurable improvement in recovery for patients with microvascular damage, she didn't celebrate with champagne or headlines. She went to the lab alone after everyone had left, sat at her old workstation, and ran her fingers over the edge of the bench. It was smooth, calm, steady, like the future if you made it so. Outside, the rain had begun, a fine mist settling over the city. She walked home through it without an umbrella, the air clean against her face, her steps unhurried. The next day would bring new work problems and risks. But tonight, she let the quiet have her. She had not outlasted William Brown for the sake of a rivalry. She had done it to keep a promise to herself, the people who believed, and the small hands that would one day understand what she had built. And she knew with a certainty that felt like peace, that whatever came next, she would meet it standing. If this story touched you, if you felt the weight of Beatrice's fight and the light of her victory, let yourself be part of what we're building here. Like the video, please share it with someone who needs a reminder that starting over can be the beginning of everything, and follow the channel so you're here for the next story we tell. Every view, every comment, every shared moment keeps these voices alive, because sometimes all it takes is one choice to change the ending. And sometimes that choice is yours.